Hello again, everyone. And we have had an outstanding program today, and we will certainly finish that way with two excellent programs, one of which will be on property inflation. You can't pick up a newspaper if anyone does such a thing anymore, or open a news site without hearing about inflation. The other dimension to our education today will be about social inflation and the nuclear verdicts that we're seeing in the jury room and in our courtrooms. Something that also, not just property inflation, but liability inflation, we most certainly will see flowing through our insurance premiums, and we're seeing that in combined ratios and rates, and will probably for many years into the future. So I'm going to have Victor open up our breakout rooms, and we have two excellent moderators as well, one of whom is Chris Faber, who is in fact a property adjuster, and Rodney Brennan from Liberty Mutual, who is a liability adjuster. So both of these professionals will be helping our breakout rooms navigate the talent and questioning that come from our speakers.
So, hi everyone on the call. I'm excited for the two presentations we're going to have today. Each presentation will be about 20 minutes. We'll allow about 5 minutes for Q&A. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address it in the chat box as best as possible either during the session or at the end of the session. First presentation will be presented by Julia Fuller Nakayama. And Julie, by the way, your resume is very, very impressive as I was reading it. So Julie is a senior vice president, head of accounting management at Predicate, and head of Predicate's New York office. She brings over 20 years of experience to the P&C insurance industry and advising Fortune 500 clients in the financial services sector as a management consultant. She works with Predicate's reinsurers and insurer clients to adopt and apply Predicate analytics in innovative ways that advance their strategic objectives. Julia holds an MBA from the Darden Graduate School of Business and University of Virginia, and she also has a BA in history from Yale. Her topic that she's going to cover is dealing with casualty catastrophe modeling for insurers and reinsurers. Our second presenter will be on nuclear verdicts. And so when we talk about nuclear verdicts, have you we see these big nuclear verdicts and verdict amounts from juries in the news. Have you tried to understand why do we get to that amount? Why is that seems like unconscionable amount? So Mina Mizralis, and I apologize, Mina, if I'm pronounce your last name correctly. She will be the presenter from Tyson & Mendez. Tyson & Mendez is an outstanding law firm, and bio on Mina is a chair of the complex trials and partners in Tyson & Mendez San Diego office with over 20 years of litigation and trial experience. She leads the firm's multi-attorney complex trial team focusing on complex personal injury matters. And Mina, I have to tell you, part of your resume I was impressed on, and I want to read this one segment. It says, Mina obtained a verdict of $26,000 in personal injury matter, which you think is a lot of money, but it's not. But the allegation was their alleged brain damage and loss of earnings capacity, and their plaintiff sought over $30 million in damages. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
She holds a graduate degree from University of California, Berkeley, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, very impressive. And she has a law degree from Loyola Law School. So we'll go ahead and start off with Julia. So Julia, whenever you're ready, go ahead, and thank you again.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my presentation. It's taking me a moment to get into presentation mode. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, perfect. So I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you virtually. I'm in our New York office with my colleague, Megan Dengler. And I want to say a special thank you to David Russell for inviting Predicate and me to join you all today. And also to Rodney for that very warm introduction. Thank you. And I'm going to start first by talking a little bit about Predicate. So what we do, how we approach the problem of emerging risk and how we quantify the mass litigation events that are driven by emerging liability risks, because it has a lot of bearing. It's directly relevant to how we at Predicat think about the current wave of social inflation, which is almost entirely driven by litigation finance. So we, Predicat is an emerging liability risk analytics and modeling firm. And we got our start way back in 2010 as a joint R&D venture between RAND, which is a public policy think tank that's based in Santa Monica, and Risk Management Solutions, or RMS, which is a natural catastrophe modeler. And really what we're trying to do is bring the tools and techniques of property cat modeling to the problem of emerging liability risk. So what we described as the next asbestos. How do we identify the next asbestos and then manage it? That was our convenient shorthand for the problem. And what Predicat models is what has the potential to drive mass tort litigation. So basically the nuclear verdicts of the future, where are they coming from? And can we prevent that? And we're looking for leading indicators, early warning signals of this type of litigation. And the best leading indicators, the best signals of risk are, is from the global published peer-reviewed scientific literature. So we've developed artificial intelligence technologies that mine this literature, looking for these signals of risk, which is basically scientists investigating human health harm hypotheses. And then we evaluate the likelihood of the scientific literature trending in a direction that could support causation and a plaintiff's claims in a US court of law. And we project this over a 7 to 8 year forecast window. And we also connect all these emerging risks up with 128,000 companies. And so we have a very sort of granular exposure base of data that we marry with a probabilistic forecast that quantifies both the frequency and severity of casualty relevant mass litigation events for these companies. So it's a very powerful tool. But when we first set out and we were describing the problem we were working on, we often got the reaction, well, the next asbestos is asbestos. Or, you know, it's really a problem of the 20th century. We're not that worried about it right now. But the landscape has shifted dramatically over the past several years with a resurgence of mass tort BI litigation, which we at Predicat affectionately refer to as GOT. So glyphosate, opioids, talc, leading the way. So we feel we're uniquely positioned to help insurers and reinsurers really get their arms around these emerging risks and take action on them in a proactive way so that they don't face some of these bad outcomes. So if you want to understand casualty in the US, you have to understand litigation finance. And we all know litigation finance is growing by leaps and bounds. I'm sure all of you have read the Swiss Re white paper that was published about a year ago, where they projected that litigation finance instruments would grow by 2028 to 31 billion worldwide. I think for me, what is most notable about the rise of litigation finance is the single largest category of third-party litigation finance is mass torts. So we've seen the increasing frequency of mass torts, which also brings longer latency and increased aggregation. We went from sort of nil in terms of frequency to predictably seeing 2 to 3 new mass torts initiate each year. So that's a really different environment than the one we had been living in. And Swiss Re also estimates that mass torts litigation finance instruments provide a return of about an internal rate of return of about 26%. So this is much higher than other kind of similar risky asset classes. It's higher than the return on venture capital investments. And so it continues to be an attractive place for investors to pour money into. So this is not a phenomenon that we can wish away in any way. And to make this all a bit more concrete in terms of what this means for all of us, I'd like to talk about 5 litigation finance products that have been developed and are being marketed and sold right now. So the first is non-recourse loans to plaintiffs. And so these are very inexpensive loans to plaintiffs so they can pursue their litigation and they don't have to pay them back unless they win. And they cover all kinds of expenses. They cover living expenses. So they really sustain the plaintiff over the long haul. The plaintiff can hang in there and wait for the jury award. They have no incentive to settle. And obviously it undermines the insurer's ability to drive to settlement. And the other aspect of this is that a lot of these, the claims that are likeliest to settle are also most appealing to juries. And so non-recourse loans are basically one of the sole drivers behind the social inflation and nuclear verdicts that we've seen over the past several years. The second area of investment I'd like to talk about is loans to specialist law firms. So plaintiffs' bar firms that have large concentrations of mass tort lawsuits in very specific areas. And this type of litigation is very capital intensive. The specialist law firms have high capital needs. And so the loans to these firms enable them to pursue kind of what otherwise would be risky litigation, makes it viable for them to do this. And the loans also function as kind of a contingency fee volatility insurance. So it smooths out the volatility and also makes it much more feasible to pursue this type of litigation. And so again, one of the sole factors driving the rise of the increase in mass torts is the availability of capital via these loans to specialist law firms. So the third observation has to do with the fact that litigation funders like to partner with states, county, city, tribal nations, governments. So what they say often is that they don't like to invest in personal injury lawsuits. But through this fourth party litigation, they are partnering up in a way to target large corporate defendants. So what they say and what they do are a little bit different. And it's also safe to say that these are very complex multi-year litigations. And there's just no way that some of these smaller local government entities could pursue them without the availability of litigation funding. So the success of the opioids litigation is attributable to litigation funding and also probably sort of a second wave climate litigation. Finally, we come to the securitization products. So one is a primary securitization where portfolios of lawsuits are bundled together, put into a special purpose vehicle and syndicated out to investors. So it's a common asset structure and it's very popular with institutional investors, pension funds, university endowments, life insurers. So anybody looking for a return, you got to pay the freight. And this is a good way to do that. I mean, we know that Harvard University's endowment, for example, is invested into these types of securitization. And there are also derivatives of these securitizations, so bundles of bundles. And they basically set a floor, a minimum guaranteed return. And this market has been growing very rapidly. As I said, life insurers are investors, and insurance brokers are syndicating these securitizations. And so you have a lot of insurance industry participants who are benefiting in one way or another from litigation finance. So we have a very changed environment before us. And it's, natural to ask the question, well, what can we and should we do? And then what are the next big mass torts looming out there on the horizon? So when we talk to our clients about how to respond to this changed environment and what are the new kinds of underwriting and risk management strategies they need to be thinking about, we go back to Predicat's emerging risk framework. So basically, Predicat has developed this framework that divides the emergence of risk into 3 phases based on how imminent litigation might be. And this is always underlying all of our models, but we did this to make it very explicit and to make emerging risk actionable. So there are very specific actions you can take in each phase, and otherwise you're just sort of dealing with this as an act of God, and it's really hard to know what to do and when to do it. And so, and obviously another one of our goals is to push action upstream, so away from the litigation phase and enable clients to take action before something turns into litigation. So the first phase is emerging interest. This is where scientific research is just beginning, initial investigation into human health harm hypotheses. There may be only a handful of articles published, but it still gives you a signal that there's something going on and something that scientists consider worthy of investigating. And you can also see from our analytics that you can understand whether the science is gaining momentum, and is it gaining momentum in a way that could propel this risk into the emerging damage phase. And it's important to note that in the emerging interest phase, we assess the chance of litigation activating at less than 1%. Then we come to emerging damage. The storm clouds are gathering, the scientific literatures are broadening, they're deepening, and they could be used as evidence in court. But there's still more options for action. You can think about where you're placing your layer. You can think about targeted exclusions. You can think about super active aggregations management strategy, where then you cascade down to the point of underwriting. And finally, we come to emerging litigation, where the house is on fire, you're in a somewhat more defensive posture, you're thinking about what are our claims defense strategies, what are our, are we adequately reserved, and that sort of thing. And the question we most often get when we're discussing this framework and the agents that we've identified as being in the emerging interest phase is, well, how many of these emerging interest agents actually end up in litigation? And on average, how long does it take them to get from emerging interest to developing into litigation? So it's difficult to respond with absolute specificity. But what we have observed over the past several years has been there's been an enormous acceleration from the ED phase to litigation. So basically, moving from emerging interest to emerging damage, you're moving at the pace of science, and that moves however fast it moves. I mean, I think about arsenic and rice and the arsenic and baby food litigation. So there was literature around arsenic dating back to the 70s. And it started to develop more, and arsenic and rice was solidly emerging damage. And, as we know, in recent years, there are a bunch of lawsuits around arsenic and heavy metals in baby food. So there's a tremendous acceleration from the emerging damage phase into litigation. There's a real compression of that time period, and it's all due to the availability of litigation finance capital to the plaintiff's bar. So in thinking about, well, what's looming out there on the horizon, I want to talk about a few kind of emergent new next risks that are kind of poster children for this acceleration to litigation. The first is addictive software design. So about 3 or 4 years ago, Predicat was thinking about how we wanted to model and represent in our software addiction risk and harms. Obviously, the opioids litigation was very much on our minds, but we were also focused on screen time. And the challenge for us was we weren't really sure, well, what are the compensable harms associated with excessive screen time? And we, as we began investigating, we saw that there's a really significantly developing literature around mental health harms, and especially adolescent mental health harms. And those, that literature has continued to develop at an alarming rate. And as we know, in the wake of the Frances Haugen Facebook whistleblower testimony last year, social media platform companies have been targeted in litigation. I also want to, and so the science very much supports that. With regard to microplastics a couple of years ago debuted in our emerging interest phase, very quickly moved to emerging damage. And there is litigation emerging over microplastics. And I think the most notable thing about this risk is it has an explosively developing bodily injury literature. So our chief scientist said he's never seen scientific literature develop so fast. And basically 50% of the articles investigating microplastics and human health harms were published in the past 12 months. So there has been some litigation that's more like consumer protection and environmental actions, but the mass tort BI litigation is no doubt just around the corner. And finally, we come to industrial meat production. And I just want to note here that obviously with addictive software design and industrial meat production, the vector of harm is a business activity, not a chemical product or hazard. And industrial meat production is interesting because it's responsible for about 20% of methane emissions. And the big industrial meat producers are very heavily insured. And they are written almost entirely on the occurrence trigger. So they're very tempting targets for litigation. And finally, we have our Predicat's top emerging risk of 2022, PFAS now and forever. The PFAS are known as the forever chemicals because they do not break down in the environment. They could also be known as the everywhere chemicals because they're truly ubiquitous. So you see that they have a massive industrial footprint. They are indeed everywhere. They're in clothing and textiles and cosmetics and food wrappers and packaging, carpeting, construction materials. It's truly astonishing. And they're associated with a lot of serious human health harms. So cancers, endocrine system injuries like type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disorders, ADHD, developmental delays, you name it. And you might be thinking, well, the litigation is pretty well developed around PFAS. I mean, if you saw the movie Dark Waters, you know that the first lawsuit was filed against DuPont in 1999 by a farmer in Parkersburg, West Virginia, because his cows were dying from drinking contaminated water on his property, and members of his family were getting sick. But this litigation has so many different directions to go in. For example, and I know I think I'm running out of time, but I just have to talk about the biosolids litigation because I think it's so interesting. So basically, water filtration treatment plants, paper mills produce this kind of PFAS contaminated sludge as a byproduct of their processes. And it gets sold to farmers who use it as fertilizer. And then it contaminates the soil and the fields, it contaminates water supplies. So this is like a pretty rapidly developing litigation. We have a feature in our software called the litigation tracker that compiles all casualty relevant complaints for all of the agents that we track. And it's a high growth litigation. So I think it just shows you where this could go. And we're working on a white paper with Milliman, the actuarial consulting firm, on PFAS and all the dimensions of the problem of PFAS, but specifically how better to reserve for PFAS. So we'll be recommending some new approaches to reserving for PFAS, including exposure-based reserving. And it's really intended to make the industry more resilient in the face of emerging risks that can develop into mass litigation events. And, you know, finally, what are we to do with proliferating emerging risks and abundant capital available to the plaintiff's bar? So we at Predicat firmly believe we are not helpless in the face of these developments. The insurance industry, you know, experienced a number of periods of sustained loss, reserve restatements as a result of mass litigation episodes, significantly asbestos. And with the reserve restatements, there was a bit of a downward spiral to insolvency because basically historical claims data cannot capture emerging risks. So what we're proposing is that with our very granular exposure-based data, we combine that with the insurer's historical claims data, and it really gives a complete picture for pricing and reserving and can lead to sustained profitability in casualty. So that is the direction we are headed. That's our vision, and we invite you all to join us. So thank you.
Julie,
any questions?
Thank you so much, Julie. What I'm going to do, because we're running short on time, I want to give Mina enough time. If you guys have questions, just go ahead and put it in the chat box, and then we'll go ahead and try to address it. And Julie, if you'd be so kind, why don't you put your contact information in the chat box in case somebody wants to follow up with you. And then Mina, why don't you go ahead and take over. I apologize, we're cutting you a little short on time. As Mina's getting ready to take over and present her, I think you have to release the screen, Julie. There you go. Okay, as Mina's presenting, I'll tell you this. She's going to talk about what drives these nuclear verdict strategies and approaches in defending them, and more information. So go ahead, Mina. Thank you again. And thank you again, Julia.
All right, thank you. Let me make sure I've got control of the screen here. I do, great. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Julia, for that really interesting presentation. We're going to talk a little bit more about what drives nuclear verdicts, as Rodney mentioned, what we can do to stop them. And, you know, just as a background, I work with Tyson & Mendez. I'm a partner with Tyson & Mendez I've worked there for the past 11 years. This is just a little timeline of the progress with our firm in the past several years. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. Many of you may know of Bob Tyson's book, Nuclear Verdicts, Defending Justice for All. I've had the privilege of trying cases with Bob and apart from Bob, and using the methods and strategies that we recommend in the book that I'm going to be talking about today. So start just real quick on this timeline, starting with in 1994, when Tyson & Mendez was just a twinkle in Bob Tyson's eyes, till about 10 years ago when the Howell versus Hamilton Meats decision came down. Bob Tyson argued that before the California Supreme Court. Many of you may be familiar with that decision. And recently in 2020, we came out with the Nuclear Verdicts book that we'll be talking about today. So many of you have probably seen these dramatic headlines regarding nuclear verdicts. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these, but I'm going to kind of put them up there for you guys to see. Is we're seeing these repeated large verdicts across the country, all over the country, really. I mean, and we're talking about in the hundreds of millions in Washington, obviously in California, in Texas, in Florida. Yes, and Rodney is cutting to the end here. Yeah, we're seeing so many of these large verdicts. Last year was the thing on everyone's minds was this $1 billion Florida verdict. Lots of other multi-millions, hundreds of millions, culminating this year in this $301 billion award in Texas, that for a wrongful death action. I have to say, I've presented on this very slide before, and the last time I presented on it, the largest verdict was $1 billion. Now we're showing $301 billion. Needless to say, the trend is that we're seeing more and more of these types of verdicts across the country. So, you know, what is it? What is driving these verdicts? What do you guys think? And go ahead and chat in if you want. What do you guys think is the number one emotion that drives these nuclear verdicts? Does anyone want to take a guess at what do you think the? Yep, Rodney got it. Yep, you guys are all got it, Karen. Exactly, anger. Anger is what drives these verdicts. And a lot of times people think it's, yeah, I mean, you got the idea, deep pockets and a need to pay. A lot of people think that the number one emotion is actually sympathy. But in fact, what we find in these disproportionate verdicts, the number one emotion is anger. So what we'll be talking about today is one of the things that we really focus on in our cases is what do we do to diffuse that anger so that we don't receive these nuclear verdicts, so that we obtain a just verdict in our cases. So what else is driving these verdicts? Well, what we're seeing in the last 10 to 15 years, the plaintiff's attorneys have been changing the way they try these cases, and this anger factor is a big component of that. So some of the primary strategies that we're seeing, I'm going to talk about in a second, but what do you guys think is maybe the simplest way that a plaintiff's attorney, the simplest tactic the plaintiff's attorney used is to get a large verdict? All right, I clicked on it too soon. They ask for it. They ask for a large verdict. That is the simplest, most basic way to get a large verdict, and the science and the psychology and everything shows that it works. That just asking for a larger verdict works to obtain a larger verdict. The next three items, they kind of all go together. There's a lot of interest on the plaintiff's side, and on our side too, of course, on the jury research and the psychology that leads to these larger verdicts. They're recognizing that anger is the primary emotion that fuels it, not sympathy. They're using strategies like the reptile theory that many of you, I'm sure, have heard of. So the reptile theory is a way of appealing to the juror's sense of fear of danger and convincing them that anything less than the safest actions, the safest course is a danger to us all. The jury research and psychology also shows that things like primacy and recency, you know, how early and how often they repeat the same things like numbers and certain angering themes help in their cases. The surprising one too is that, you know, they're no longer pushing for sympathy. You may have heard of attorneys like Nick Rowley out of California, who tries cases all over the country. He's given presentations on, hey, you don't want your plaintiffs to be sympathetic anymore. You want them to be stoic. Why wouldn't they want to go for sympathy? Well, it's because they've learned that the anger actually helps to lead to these larger verdicts. So we're seeing a kind of a two-part formula for how this plays out at trials. And what we often see is the attorneys try to do this thing where they shift the focus away from the incident itself. And the second part of this is they paint the incident as a result of a systemic issue. So let's say you have a pretty simple fact, like the defendant's employee, you know, ran a red light or did something, you know, drove in in an erratic way. The spin they'll put on it is not just, hey, they ran a red light. The case becomes about how the defendant failed to properly train the employee. They failed to have the proper training or policies and procedures. So what else? You might see it as defendant terminated an employee, but that's the fact. But the thing that's focused on is this defendant failed to follow the company handbook. They failed to follow their own policies and procedures. So the case becomes something different than just the facts. They make it about the systemic issue that plays this role in creating anger. Oops, all right. So what can we do? We know what drives these verdicts. What can we do to prevent them? What can we do to stop them and have just verdicts in these cases? We like to focus on three things: education, communication, and innovation. I'm going to talk about each of those. So we're going to probably talk the most about education. Let's talk a little bit about education. So one of the things that we need to do to educate is to actually come up with methods and strategies to prevent these nuclear verdicts. And we do have the book that has multiple strategies, and I think it's 12 different strategies for how to prevent nuclear verdicts. The way you know that education works with the plaintiff's bar is how they react to it. So when this book came out, 2 years ago, the response from the plaintiff's bar was immediate. And there were multiple seminars and webinars being put on to counter the book. You guys probably heard of David Ball. He's one of the co-authors of the book, the Reptile Theory book, and on the book Ball on Damages. He wrote a scathing review of the book, giving it only 1 star, that it was a completely unoriginal book, even though it's probably the only book on this topic. And he's also put on multiple webinars indicating, how to supposedly debunk the nuclear verdicts strategies. And we see this continuing even in this year. The law firm of the Simon Law Group, some of you may have heard of, they're out of Los Angeles, well-known plaintiff's law firm in Los Angeles. They have a 10-page article in a plaintiff's bar magazine solely dedicated to disarming each of the strategies mentioned in the book. So when a plaintiff's firm is writing a 10-page article on how to disarm strategies like personalizing the defendant, is something that we should all be able to do and shouldn't be seen as outrageous or offensive. There's a whole section in here on how to prevent the defendant from, for example, personalizing the defendant. So again, we see how the education is being responded to, and note how the plaintiff's bar is also educating each other. So that's an important component of this. How many of you have heard of Gary Dordick? Anyone here heard of Gary Dordick out of California? He's a well-known plaintiff's attorney in LA again. So, all right, yeah, you've heard of him. So he posted something on Instagram recently. He posted a picture of his dog. Apparently his new puppy had eaten his allegedly handwritten opening statement. But the interesting thing here is if you look at the coffee table, there's actually a copy of Bob's book, Nuclear Verdicts, on the coffee table for Gary Dordick. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't even keep nuclear verdicts on my coffee table. So I thought that was interesting. And my colleague Thomas and I were joking about this. It looks like the puppy really hated Gary Dordick's opening statement, but he seems to have loved nuclear verdicts because he definitely left it alone. So Gary Dordick also wrote an article for the plaintiff's bar, and his article, let's see if we can get it here, is called Nuclear Verdicts, Fact or Fiction? Fact or Fiction? Well, I can tell you the conclusion of the article is that it's a fact, and as you guys all know, you've seen the verdicts. But the interesting thing here was not his conclusion, but what he said about it. So this was interesting. I'll read you a couple of his quotes here. Let's see if I can So he says the short answer is yes. There have been nuclear verdicts in the last several years. Numerous verdicts have appeared disproportionate to the actual damages and tapping into their anger. Those of us that spend much time in the courtrooms picking juries have noticed the jurors seem extremely hostile and distrustful of corporations. Plaintiffs' lawyers have become more skilled at identifying jurors ready to award significant damages and tapping into their anger. So again, this article is written as sort of as observational, but it's also kind of saying, it's letting us all know what the plaintiffs are doing to achieve these large awards. So what can we do in response? So here I'm going to list out a number of the methods, and we don't have a lot of time to go into each one of these, but a lot of the methods that we use to help diffuse anger, tell a better story, obtain a just verdict in the case. And, you know, we recommend that, hey, when you have a case going to trial, ask these questions. These are great questions to ask, and make sure that your defense counsel is thinking about, again, what angers a jury. You want to always know in each case, what's going to make the jury angry about it. It might be that there was a car accident and the defendant driver was really young, and maybe he shouldn't have been driving for the company, something like that. And you'll want to find a way to diffuse that anger, find a way that, to show that maybe the defendant's actions were reasonable. Another way to diffuse anger is to show that you care about the plaintiff. We can talk about that briefly in a moment. But what else? So other things that we do is we develop a theme in the case. You need to know what the theme is for your trial. It shouldn't be just a response to the plaintiff's theory and theme. The story should not, start in the same place that the plaintiff's story starts. Usually you're going to have your own story of the case. We also recommend accepting responsibility in every case. Accepting responsibility is a really big way that we're able to diffuse anger. And you want to think about what you accept responsibility for. In a case, even if you're denying liability, you can still accept responsibility for driving with reasonable care, for following the standard of care in the industry, for maintaining a reasonably safe premises. Giving a number, we recommend giving a number in every single case. This is a very big, important component of diffusing nuclear verdicts. Is if you're going for a defense verdict and you don't give a number, then the only number that the jury is left with is the plaintiff's number, which we always know is going to be an exorbitant number. So we recommend giving a number even when you're going for a defense verdict. And again, like I mentioned earlier, personalize your client, a corporate client. Think about what the jury should know about the company. This can be things like the corporate story, and a lot of times the corporation, as we know, is made up of individuals, and a lot of times there's a story behind how the corporation came to be and the work that people put in to make the corporation what it is today. And then last but not least, one of the biggest components we're seeing in these nuclear verdicts is these large non-economic damages awards. And the worst thing that people can do in these cases is not argue non-economic damages, because in most states, the statutes don't give the jury really any good instruction on how to award non-economic damages. So it's imperative that the defense counsel argues to the jury about why the number that we give in non-economic damages is reasonable and how it will help the plaintiff. That's another way that we show that we care. So the way we always do it is we talk about two things. We talk about the impact of the accident on the plaintiff, and most attorneys do that, but we also talk about the impact of the money on the plaintiff's life. So for example, if we're saying, hey, you need to award this plaintiff $100,000 in non-economic damages, we talk about all the things that $100,000 can bring to the plaintiff, peace of mind and things that they're able to do with it, travel or buy a motorhome and camp. A lot of people like to travel in a motorhome, and you can even afford to maybe buy a motorhome and do that kind of thing with that money. So we anchor the money in something that shows that we understand the plaintiff's life, what they're able to do, and what they could do with this money. All right. So that's the education component of it. We've got a couple of other components: communicate and innovate. Communicate really is just, hey, we all need to share information just like the plaintiff's bar is. So make sure our panel counsel are all talking to each other. Make sure that you are all talking to each other. We presented a Nuclear Verdicts Defense Institute this year, where we gave a trial training for anybody who wanted to attend on the defense side. So another way of collaborating on the defense side, just like the plaintiff's attorneys collaborate. And then last but not least, innovation. We need, we all need to be innovative in our response and approach to this. One of the things that Tyson Mendez did to try to innovate was come up with a new subsidiary, TM Halo, which is a subsidiary. It's like a parachute team, basically designed to come in and try, some of the biggest sort of bet the company type of cases under a new pay structure. So instead of just an hourly rate, it's a value rate involving a flat fee and a success fee as well. So we've got some other exciting innovations on the horizon, and I'm going to go ahead and play this video. All right, more on that to come, coming soon. And if anybody wants to know more information or wants to be kept in the loop on anything that we're doing, feel free to just sign up for our mailing list. You can get updates on that. And if anybody has any questions, I want to open up for questions.
Yeah, Mina, thank you so much for doing that. And I apologize. I know you could probably spend an hour talking about this presentation. It's such an interesting topic. So I'm sorry, I cut both you and Julia down to a short time frame. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, put it in the chat box, or you can talk right now. And then Julie, do you want to put in the chat box if anyone has questions, they can contact you or contact your your office for any follow-up information?
Yeah, I did put my email in.
Also
Very
Mina as
happy
well.
to take any questions.
And Mina, would you also put your contact in the chat box as well?
Yes.
Thank you, Julia.